I would like to welcome everybody to our Are You Ready to Garden, episode 3. We're really excited about tonight's presentation because we have a great speaker, one of our colleagues from Monmouth County. And this is series 3, and we're going to be on every Thursday at 6:30. Our team brings together experts from Rutgers University and the New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station, as well as horticultural experts from New Jersey farm groups and many of our farmers willing to share their expertise with us. I'm your host, Bill Livick from Rutgers Cooperative Extension. I'm the agricultural agent for Rutgers Cooperative Extension in Middlesex County. I'm also a professor at Rutgers University, and I teach 3 courses at the university in the areas of sustainable agriculture and starting and managing small farms, several practicum courses that we have up there. My background is I grew up on a small farm, and I still actually work with my brothers on a farm in Chesterfield, New Jersey. So that's part of my horticultural therapy on weekends to work on the farm. So it's a good thing. I love working on the farm. I love working with plants. I want to first take a moment to thank our supporters, especially our Middlesex County freeholders and our Monmouth County freeholders. I want to give a shout out because we've got Bill Erickson on today from Monmouth County. He's been kind enough to join us and share his expertise with us. I also want to thank the New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station, which really provides all the support for us at Rutgers and allows Rutgers Cooperative Extension and much of our research and the good work that we do to help farmers and landscapers and gardeners throughout New Jersey continue to receive the latest and greatest information from Rutgers University. We also plan to visit over the next month and a half some local farms throughout the state and taste some of the Jersey fresh produce, and also talk to farmers about what they have ready and actually go out and do some harvest of asparagus and strawberries and really kind of show you what's going on. And our farmers are out there and they are ready for you. So they've got their direct markets that they're opening up, and we're following a very strict protocol, and they've got some great produce that they're getting ready for you. So if you visit our website that we're going to show you towards the end, we'll send you to farms in Middlesex and Monmouth and counties all throughout the state. We're also going to discuss at some point preserving vegetables and fruits so that they will last into the season for your entire family. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker for today, Bill Erickson. He's going to give a presentation on edible landscaping. I like to call it free-range grazing in the yard. Bill, I don't know, I guess you wouldn't use that term. But our presenter, Bill Erickson, is the Agriculture and Natural Resource Extension Agent in Monmouth County, and he focuses on nursery, turfgrass, and agricultural innovation. He's been working in various aspects of agriculture over the past 15 years. He operated his own farm in Maine. He actually consults on edible landscapes for residential clients. He's led many courses focused on sustainable agriculture and soil fertility for commercial growers and homeowners. And he works with college students now. And the best part is that now we have Bill Erickson on our team at Rutgers Cooperative Extension, so we get to work with him. So it doesn't get any better than that. So welcome, Bill. And I would guess that edible landscaping, in my mind, would kind of depend on if you're a person or an animal, because I know in my landscape, deer seem to love almost everything I grow, so everything seems to be edible in my landscape. But I'm going to turn it over to you. So we're going to listen to Bill Erickson over the next hour. And welcome, Bill, to our program.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, everybody, for coming and for having me on this program. I think it's a great opportunity for people to learn more about having their own gardens, and we're going to focus tonight on edible landscaping for human consumption. And not that animals or wildlife couldn't eat some of these crops. We're going to focus on some of these edible landscape crops that people might desire to have in their gardens. So just an outline of what we're going to talk about today. Just going to give a brief introduction to the concept of edible landscaping, what that means, and how you might think about incorporating that into your home site. We're going to look at how to evaluate your site to see what are the physical characteristics of your landscape what resources are already there, what areas might need some improvement, and then to compare that with your individual gardening goals. So how does what you want to do with your garden actually match up with the opportunities that exist on your landscape? And we'll see that there are options for every landscape and every individual. There's always something that you can grow on your land, no matter how small the property you have. And then one of the most parts, I think, of what we'll talk about is the plants themselves. And so we'll get into looking at some individual plant species for edible landscapes, and some plants that might be familiar to you and some that you may have never heard before. So I hope everybody learns one new plant today at least. That would be great. That being said, this is very much an introductory lecture on some of these topics, whereas we could discuss any one of these individual plant species for hours on end. And so there's a lot more information that you can find on these, and a lot more research and reading and learning opportunities on any of these aspects. So we're going to help to make some of those resources available to you. So if there are certain things that are interesting for you, you can pursue those, or you can also get in touch with us at Cooperative Extension, and we're happy to help you learn more about any of those things. So this is sort of the introduction, and we're always here to help you along the way in creating your gardens. So before we get into it, let's talk about some of the benefits to gardening in general, why we would be excited and enthusiastic to do this. And, for many people, it might be growing fresh food for yourself or for your family, or to share with your neighbors. And, that's a great benefit. It also provides physical exercise of being outdoors, moving, and if you're stretching and using proper body posture, gardening can actually be, very good stretching and physical exercise for you, and just spending time outdoors and connecting to nature, especially with many of us spending more time indoors now and working from home and having WebEx presentations instead of tours through the field, and, opportunities that we can get to be outside are a literal breath of fresh air right now. And this all contributes to mental well-being. So that occurs from the garden, the biofeedback from being in nature and breathing fresh air, and just reducing the amount of screen time that we're having in the day. It's also a good way to have a sense of accomplishment. Anybody who's mowed the lawn before knows when they see that tall grass and then you make a few passes with the mower and you look back, you feel good about yourself that you achieved something. You could do something. You improved the landscape and you made it look better. And so we can achieve that in our gardens as well. We're also, from an ecological perspective, we can use our gardens to increase biodiversity. So we can get more diversity of plants, native species, and we can encourage insects and birds and other wildlife to thrive and to create a habitat for them in our yards, no matter how small. We'll be looking at an example through this slideshow of a small residential yard, and we're going to see several different plant species growing there, and and that impacts other organisms as well. Sometimes it's maybe not thought of, though, that gardening is very much intellectual stimulation. So there's a lot of thought that goes into the planning, the understanding of how to properly care for plants, soil fertility, pest control, tuning into the weather, proper pruning and harvesting. There is really a lot of learning and a lifelong opportunity for learning that comes from engaging with your garden. And the last point I want to make is creative expression. So your landscape is a canvas, and the plants that we're going to talk about are the palette of colors, textures, smells, and tastes that can go into creating really this living work of art, and a place that you should feel good to be in. So there are no rules on the creative aspects of gardening. It should be a reflection of what you see, and it's a combination of your experience and nature coming together to create something. So that's part of this as well. That's a very important part of this. So when we're talking about edible landscaping, we're incorporating fruit and nut trees, berry bushes, vegetables, herbs, edible flowers into our landscape. Our landscape is both productive, producing food for humans, and it's aesthetically interesting. So we're still utilizing many of the concepts of ornamental landscape design and ornamental plants. They're not exclusive of the edible landscape, but we're incorporating our edibles throughout. And so part of this is to look at some of our edible plants in a different way, appreciating their flowers, textures, fall color, in addition to their food-producing capacity, and incorporating them into our ornamental landscapes. So it's this integration of food and aesthetic gardens. And so in the picture, we can see there are peach trees and cherry bushes and figs integrated with some classic landscape plants like lilac and wisteria. And part of this allows for flowers and color throughout a longer period of the season. So we have some of the peaches are some of the first to bloom, followed by the lilacs and the wisteria. And so we can continually have different flowers occurring in the landscape, and then later have fruit that is also harvested from the same spot. So we're looking at the ornamental qualities of edible plants and still observing elements of landscape design, like the lines, balance, form, colors, and texture. And this all comes down to individual creative preference. So there's many things that you can do, and this is just expanding your palette of plants that can be incorporated. Integrating perennial plants and annual plants is something that also occurs in the edible landscape, especially when you think that mature fruit trees are going to take several years to grow into the mature space that they'll occupy. So in the meantime, annual plants or low-growing perennials can occupy those sunny areas of the garden. So the garden can change from year to year, and it can look different every year, and it will as it evolves and as the plants get bigger and grow. So that's something to consider, and to not limit yourself into which plants are going into your landscape. And this is applicable for residential settings, so your home, no matter what size landscape you have, but we can also incorporate edibles into parks, schools, or businesses as well. And again, edible plants can be incorporated into any style of gardening. So it can be a formal, very formal garden, it can be a wild garden, native plant gardens can be comprised totally of edibles. The style is your choice, and incorporating the edibles into it is just another option that you have in creating this landscape. So one of the first things you want to think about are, what are your goals? So to be clear with your goals, this can set your intention for creating the garden. And a lot of people are concerned about producing fresh and high quality food for your family or for your neighbors or for yourself. Maybe you want to create a tranquil plant sanctuary where you can come home after work and spend time in the garden and decompress from the stress of the day. Maybe you want to encourage pollinators and create a sanctuary for them, a habitat where plant species can attract many beneficial insects. Maybe you want to create a beautiful landscape, but it's very low maintenance. So you have time to get it established, but you're looking for the most disease-resistant and drought-resistant plants. That's possible too. We can restore degraded land using native plants as well. That can be another goal. Maybe you want year-round flower blooms and different color and aesthetics throughout your yard. So all these things can be incorporated into an edible landscape. And the last point, which I think is one of the most important points, is that gardening encourages lifelong learning opportunities for young people. And especially when we have more children home from school and being homeschooled right now, to be able to get outside and to engage with nature, to learn about gardening, to learn about soil and insect pests and plants, all while doing something physical, and to see the long-term growth of these plants as they age as well. This can be very beneficial for learning practical skills for young people. So Sometimes we need a little bit of reality check when we're getting excited about gardens, because seed catalogs and presentations that have lots of nice pictures of plants can get us very excited to grow things in the garden. And seeds are always very innocent in the seed packet, and the plants are very innocent when they're in the gardening catalogs, but when we have them and we plant them, we have to take care of them. It's our responsibility to take care of the plants. So just some practical considerations to think about before getting started would include, how much space do you actually have? Do you have acres of fields that you want to create an edible landscape in, or do you have a small patio and a deck and you can only do containers? Either one can turn into an edible landscape, but it's just, being realistic about it. Another good practical consideration is to think about how much time you actually want to spend working in your garden. So as we all know, gardening can be work. It's good work, it's great work for all the reasons we've stated before, but it is going to take time, and some of that is going to have to happen in the heat of the summer. So think about how much time you want to spend, and let that influence the size of your garden. Another aspect to that is that you can do the work yourself, or you can hire professionals, or you can do a hybrid of the two. You can do the design yourself and hire landscaping professionals to do the work, or you can work with a landscape designer to implement the ideas that you have and to bring them about. Or you can do some of the work, and maybe once a year you have a team come in, a professional team, to come in and do the cleanup of the garden. So all of those options are available to you. But you do want to think about what your budget is. So plant material, their maintenance, any soil amendments, for example, all these things will have a cost to them, and it's a good idea to sketch out a budget before getting started. And one of the most important things also to think about are, what are the growing conditions on your property? So New Jersey as a whole, we have a range of plant hardiness zones, and these refer to the average annual minimum temperature that we receive each winter. And so plants can only survive in zones, they have cold tolerance limits. So the USDA has a plant hardiness zone map, and you can actually go online and type your zip code into this program, and it will give you a more accurate reading. But most of us fall somewhere between 6A to 7B. So you want to make sure when you're selecting plants that they're rated for these cold hardiness zones. It's also a good idea to learn the average temperatures and rainfall of your area, and then when does most of the rain fall? Does it occur in the summer, the fall, the spring? Do we have wet seasons or dry seasons? So understanding those aspects can help to inform your decisions as well. However, as anybody who has been paying attention to the weather this year knows, each season is very unpredictable. So we can have unseasonal frosts, we can have strong winds, we can have days of rain. So every season is really different, but this is just a good starting place to anchor some of your decisions. Your individual site is also going to have microclimates, and so this refers to specific environmental conditions around your plant or on your landscape. And so if you're on an exposed hillside, for example, you're going to have more issues with wind. If you're in a low area, you might be in a frost pocket and might receive frost more readily than other more protected areas. So these differences in sunlight, heat, moisture, soil type, and wind can have a big impact on your plants. Even on your own individual property, the example that we're looking at here, on the south side of this stone wall, the sun is absorbed by the wall, and it's reflected to the plants, creating a warmer and drier area for growing plants. On the north side of the wall, however, where the sun is not reaching, we get cooler and wetter areas. So this fixture in the landscape of the stone wall is influencing to a significant degree the plants that can be grown on either side of it. And that's something to take into consideration. So this could also refer to your building, or the shade of trees, or sheds, for example. So pay attention to your landscape and notice which areas receive the most sun, which areas are protected from wind, and this is going to influence which plants fit better in each of those locations. So a southern-facing aspect is going to receive the most sun in your garden. Southeast is going to get the morning sun, and southwest is going to receive the sun in the afternoon. The north side of your building is going to be in the most shade. And so these are just factors that we want to work with when designing which plants can go and will thrive in those different areas. Most fruiting species require sun for the fruit to ripen and the sugars to fully develop. So we want to pay attention to that if we're planting fruit-producing plants in those areas. You also want to think about how close you are to an irrigation source. So if you're going to have to be watering your garden, but your water source is very far away, you might want to rethink the location and sort of integrate those things together so you're able to get your plants water. Noticing where the predominant winds come from, and if they're blocked by any structures, you may also want to install a windbreak to help to protect your garden from any wind damage. Existing trees and shrubs can be worked with, but you want to keep distance from them so there isn't competition for shade or water or nutrients. And then especially black walnuts and butternuts, which produce a juglans compound that can have an inhibitory effect on the growth of other plants. So this is a defense mechanism of these trees. They're great trees to have in the landscape, but you need to keep distance away from them if you're planting other species. Structures can influence shade as well. And one important point about gardening is to start small, do it well, and then to expand as needed. So it's much better to have a manageable garden that you can take care of, that you can be proud of, and that it's not a source of stress for you. And then next year, when you feel confident, you can add a little more to it. Well-drained soil is very important also for a lot of the species we're going to talk about. Plants are not going to want to have their roots too wet. That can cause rot and several diseases to occur. So laying out an edible landscape, we can incorporate different layers in the ecosystem. So just like the forest or natural ecosystem occurs, we can integrate these different perennial species together. So the tallest plants in our system are going to be fruit and nut trees, followed by our shrub layer. We have vines that can climb vertical structures, an herbaceous layer that is in the 1 to 2 foot high range, and then ground covers that creep along the ground. And so we're going to look at examples of all of these different types of plant species a little bit later, grouped in these different categories. So if you're looking for something tall or medium or low growing for your garden, there are several different options that are available. It's important also, this will help to sketch a design. It does not have to be an elaborate design or a color design or anything for that matter. But if you have a property map that's drawn to scale and you can make a copy of it, sketching the plants into your design can be really helpful. And drawing the plants to scale at their mature size will really let you know how many plants you can realistically fit into an area. So when you're buying young plants, they're very small, but you might not realize how big they're actually going to get. So usually anytime you buy a plant, it will say the height and the width at maturity, and so those are the numbers you should use when designing and integrating your plants together. So just some ideas, to hopefully impress upon you the idea that there's, no landscape that can't be recovered. So this is a southwest-facing sandy soil in a coastal area where grass that is, drought-stressed and heat-stressed, only surviving clumps, some weeds, really not doing so well. But in a short amount of time, with just some compost and wood chips and correcting soil amendments, we can bring more life and biodiversity to this site. We take a look at the roadside as well, and I'll preface this by saying that edible plants generally should not be planted along the roadside because of contaminants that can come off of the road salts, petrochemicals, anything like that. They can still be a great growing space for ornamentals, for pollinator plants, for bulbs and flowers and things like that. So this shouldn't be necessarily discarded as an area where we're just subject to have sparsely growing grass next to the road. And so just, again, with a little bit of compost and mulch and getting the soil pH right and some design, we can incorporate this living landscape. And so in the foreground, right along the roadside edge, we have multiple flowering and pollinator plant species. The wisteria, the sort of classic element that's been in this landscape for a number of years. And behind that, we have peach trees and elderberry bushes that are growing as well. So let's take a look now at this landscape. We're going to take a little garden tour. Unfortunately, we can't be together in person to go for a tour, but we're going to take a little video tour through the landscape here. And so again, we have flowering plants in the front, the wisteria sort of serving as an element of design along the fence. It's classic and been there for many years. Peach trees and elderberry shrubs, the dominant tall species behind the fence. We come around the corner. We have more irises, lilies, roses, hydrangea on the corner. So classic ornamental aesthetic species integrated. And then along the side, we have a Korean bush cherry that flowers in the spring. We're on the driveway where it's very warm next to the driveway, so that provides a heat source. And then we have figs that come around the corner, bee balm, butterfly weed, lilies growing in the understory, rosemary plants again in the understory. And you'll notice also, the wood chips and the mulch, the compost around the corner. And this is that area that was sort of the sparse grass that was really dry and heat stressed and not really growing. And so it's building up the organic matter, building up the capacity of the system to thrive in the conditions that exist. And so we have edibles and ornamentals incorporated within here. And there's a lot you can do with this. So again, your own creativity, your own style, many different plant options that are available. Are there any questions to this point on some of the background concepts? Did we have any questions come in, Rich or Bill?
Well, there's a question on recommended books for edible landscape. Do you have any ideas on that?
Yeah, there's some great books. Lee Reich has a book called Landscaping with Fruit. It's very good. He's in New York. We also have a write-up, a handout that goes along with this that has numerous resources from Rutgers Cooperative Extension and some other extension sources dealing with some of these individual species. So definitely check those out. I would recommend that one for sure.
A lot of questions coming up on how you prevent animal damage, deer, squirrels, chipmunks, rabbits, run the gamut pretty much. But how do you protect, or don't you have a problem?
So we don't have a major problem in the front yard. We'll have a little bit of damage in the front, the very front along the roadside edge. They'll chew on some of the tulips and lilies sometimes. So there's a little bit of grazing damage. Squirrels will get some peaches sometimes. Part of it is growing abundance in the yard. You can fence in an area as well. It's another option. If you have a solid fence, like in the backyard, for example. Individual wire cages are effective, and tree guards around the base of the trees for when they're first getting established and they're young and they're not able to sort of handle as much damage. So these are all options, and in a small space, human interaction and human activity can help to influence that as well. So none of these things are 100%, but in combination, they can all help.
Bill, people were asking if hickory trees might pose a problem next to other plants.
I don't believe that hickory contains the same compound as walnuts and butternuts do. The only problem I could see them posing would just be the shade and the competition with their extensive root system. So,
Thank you. I think that's it. Go ahead.
Great. So some of the things we want to look at, in terms of getting started are preparing your site. So once you have your goals in mind and, you've evaluated your site, thought about what the potential is, you can start to do some of the preparation work. And one of the first things that's really important is to have a soil test. So the Rutgers Soil Testing Lab will do a soil analysis for you. There's instructions on their website how to send them a soil sample and let them know what type of plants you're looking to grow. And they will give you custom recommendations for your yard to allow you to adjust the soil fertility and the pH. And so for perennial species, it's really important to do this before planting to get the soil correct before the plants are going in. Also good to remove the sod or any weeds so they're not competing with your plants before you're planting. And generally don't want to add fertilizer to your planting hole when putting perennial species in. This is too damaging to the young roots of plants, and so it's better to amend the soil beforehand and allow that to be incorporated into the soil before we're actually planting. So a little bit of preparation work and planning before you actually get started. When you get your plants, there's some different options in terms of how you can get your perennial species. The first being bare root, and so these are dormant plants that are planted early in the spring. And so they've been stored or dug out of the ground and shipped, and they basically haven't woken up yet. And when you plant them, they're going to wake up in a new location as if nothing's ever happened. So they need to be transplanted when they're dormant. Once they start to wake up, they can stress them out. They're going to start to use some of the energy that's contained in their roots, and they can dry out. So you want to get them planted before they start to grow early in the spring. There are potted perennials, and so these plants can be planted almost any time during the season because their roots are in potting soil in the pot, but they might require extra care when they're planted. If the heat of the summer is never really a great time to plant anything, but if you can protect them and give them enough water, it can be okay. But springtime, fall, many potted perennials are fine to transplant during those times. In order to actually plant them, you want to dig a hole that's 3 to 4 times wider than the container. So think about a salad bowl and not a post hole. So you want to get this wide area where you've removed the grass, you've dug the soil, and this gives space for the roots to spread laterally. They're going to want to spread out in search of water and nutrients. You want to make the hole as deep as the container, so the soil level of your potted plant is completely level and even with its new spot where it will be planted. You can remove the plot. If it's root bound, you can make a slit in the roots to encourage their growth. Place the pot in the bottom of the hole and backfill the hole and water it thoroughly. So newly planted plants are going to require a lot of water just to get established. Drying out is one of the most common reasons that we lose new planted material. And then on top of the plant, a good idea is to apply 2 to 3 inches or so of compost and mulch, and to keep this away from the base of the tree. So this can encourage rot if it's right up against the trunk of the tree. So pull it away from the base a little bit and spread it out around the base. And so this can help to feed the tree and provide slow-release nutrients and organic matter to reduce weed pressure and to conserve some of the moisture. Additionally, it's better to use composts that are based in leaf mulch, grass clippings, or wood chips, as opposed to manure-based compost that might be used in an annual vegetable garden, because it provides a more balanced and slow-release nutrient that's more compatible with some of our woody species. They're going to need to water young plants, especially once they're established. If they're mulched properly, minimal irrigation will generally be required, but while they're establishing and their roots are small, they're going to need watering. And they're going to be susceptible to competition from weeds. So mulching, removing the weeds, this can help your plants get established well, and then once they're have a developed root system and they're turning into large mature plants, they're going to have a better head start. We talked a little bit about protecting them from animal damage, and yeah, there are several strategies. So you can see in this picture, I've got a solid fence in the backyard, minimal damage from animals. Some of the small fruits, the strawberries, raspberries, blackberries, are susceptible to birds and squirrels when they ripen, and so there are bird netting that can be applied when the fruit is ready to ripen and then removed. So that's a good way to protect them from those types of animals. And then pruning as well. This is another maintenance aspect of taking care of the plants, and all of these different species have different ideal pruning requirements. So you prune raspberries different than you prune an apple tree. And this is just part of the learning experience, and that when you have these plants and you're interested in them, you learn about what their needs are and how it is to grow them in an optimum way. Okay, let's talk about some of the individual species. We're going to start with our fruit and nut trees. These are some of the tallest plants in the edible landscape. They're going to be the largest specimens for the most part. They will require the most space. However, there are dwarf or semi-dwarf species that can exist in small and residential areas. And so if you have your heart set on growing fruit trees, but you only have small areas, you still might be able to do that. So all is not lost. I want to recommend planting disease-resistant cultivars whenever possible. It's going to help reduce the amount of pressure you have from pathogens and the amount of controls you'll have to do in terms of spraying. So we'll see that some species are naturally more resistant than others, but it depends on the level of commitment and interest and work that you want to put in, and how much you want to produce a certain type of fruit. So you can do all of these things. And in general, full sun and soils that are well drained are going to be applicable across all of these plant species. These are going to be the best growing locations for ripe fruit and healthy plants. So let's start with something that's very common to most people. And when we think about fruit trees, maybe the first thing you think about are apples. And so they can range anywhere from 8 to 12 feet tall for a dwarf specimen, or 18 to 20 feet plus on a standard cultivar. And so this is going to be influenced by the rootstock of the apple. You want to be sure when you're choosing your apples, if you want to grow them, that if you want a dwarf tree and you only have a small space, that you're actually purchasing a dwarf tree. And so the spacing that they need is going to be influenced by whether it's a dwarf or standard-sized tree and how you want to prune them and train them. But you can get as close as 6 feet or so for spacing apples, all the way up to 20 feet if you're trying to fill a large landscape. So we have great flowers. So apple blossoms are one of the nicest flowers that we can see in the springtime, early April and May. And then fruit, depending on the species, can produce across a large window. So depending on the cultivar, some apples are going to be ready much earlier and be ready for fresh eating. So even August, September, October. And then some apples, cultivars might not be ready until November. That being said, also there are many different uses for apples, for baking, or eating fresh, and some are really good for storage. So those are usually harvested late in the season, and they're generally hard as a rock when you first harvest them, but their sugars develop and they become very, very good later in the winter, January, February, in cold storage when there might not be other fruit around. So if trying to produce year-round fruit is one of your goals, then thinking about storage apples can be a great option. They will require a second variety for cross-pollination, so make sure that you have space for more than one apple at any point. But this is one plant that does have pest and disease challenges. So to produce high-quality fruit, we're likely going to have to spray. There are organic and synthetic controls that are options, and many cultural practices and integrated pest management strategies to reduce that. But if you're thinking about apples, this is just another aspect of the management that you would have to consider before getting into it. We've got some great resources through Cooperative Extension on apple cultivation, disease management and control, and some cultivars that have some degree of disease resistance. And so it's never going to be foolproof or 100%, but these are some varieties for New Jersey that have some degree of disease resistance. Another very common, and many being the second fruit to think about, are pears. So Asian pears are both options that you can grow. And again, we have dwarf all to standard sizes, similar spacing to apples, 6 to 20 feet, depending on the size of your rootstock, whether you're using dwarf or semi-dwarf or standard. And they have profuse white flowers in April and May, so really early flowering on these plants. But we're also going to have pest and disease challenges. So spray produce high quality fruit, and we're going to require a second variety for cross-pollination. One of the really interesting things that we can do, though, in small spaces, especially with apples and pears, is to create Espalier fruit trees. And this is essentially developing living fences. And so you can see through training and pruning the way we can incorporate these fruiting species into small spaces. And if you look at the picture on the right, it's a driveway and a very small strip of actual soil that we have to plant these trees in, but amazing productivity can come off of those plants. So a dwarf apple tree can produce anywhere from 1 to 4 bushels of fruit per year at maturity. So think about how much fruit you can actually have the potential to harvest when you're getting into establishing your edible landscape. Another common fruit tree that we think of are peaches and nectarines. They grow very well in New Jersey, and there are dwarf options available for small residential areas. So anywhere from 8 foot for a dwarf tree up to 18 plus for a standard tree. So depending on the size that you're trying to fill, you can select options that would suit your landscape. On the left, these are early spring flowers of Saturn peach, and so these are occurring in April, one of the first signs of color as the season, and I think that these rival the flowers of any ornamental fruit tree, and even if it was grown for its flowers and didn't produce fruit at all, this is an amazing tree. On the right, we see fruit-producing ripening peaches on Harrow's Beauty. It's another cultivar that can be grown.
Hi, Bill.
Yeah.
People are asking questions about where they could order many of these fruit trees that you're talking about, and I see you have some listings right here. Do you want to just mention that?
Sure. Yeah. I would check in with any of your local nurseries. So in New Jersey, we've got a lot of great nurseries and garden centers that have a lot of these trees available, and if they don't have a certain cultivar that you're looking for, they can usually get it. So that would be my first stop, is to visit your local nurseries throughout New Jersey. And we're going to have a list for you at the end that was put together for nurseries throughout the state. And in Monmouth County, we have the Grown in Monmouth program that has listings of nurseries and places where plants are available within Monmouth County. So there's a lot of great nurseries in the state, and I would check in with them first.
Bill, another question that I saw several people ask was how to keep birds and other animals away from the fruit trees.
Yeah, so that's a great question. There's bird netting that can be really effective, especially if you don't have too many trees or you have small trees or if you're covering blueberries or strawberries or raspberries, for example, and it's just a netting material, you can drape it over the plants when the fruit's starting to ripen, and they'll generally leave it alone. So that's a good option for keeping sort of small animals away from fruit. Any other questions?
Yeah, there was a question about pollination. They were talking about for ones that aren't self-pollinated, like planting peaches and plums, or to solve the pollination problem, or does it require same species? So there's a question regarding the pollination of these trees and if it requires another either peach tree or plum tree to pollinate.
Yep, that's a good question. And so yeah, apples are going to require another apple for pollination. So you're going to need 2 apples if you want to have ideal pollination there. And there are certain apples that are certain cultivars that are better at pollinating others. Generally an apple will only pollinate an apple, and a pear, you're going to need other pears to pollinate them as well.
Okay.
All right, good questions. Thanks, guys. Keep them coming. So on the topic of pollinations, a lot of peaches and nectarines will self-pollinate, but it's generally better. You get more productivity if you have a second one also. But this is one that if you can only have one fruit tree, you will likely get some fruit if you just have one of these. And again, there's early, mid, and late harvestable cultivars. So if you have space for multiple different varieties, you can spread your harvest window out for several months. There will be some pest and disease issues. Some of the most common: brown rot, bacterial leaf spot, plum curculio. So these are some things that you would want to familiarize yourself with, and it is a learning opportunity to learn the pest life cycles, and when does the disease come out, and when is the best time to target it. So all of these are the intellectual stimulation part I find is learning about these different issues, and then the practical side is to apply those measures in the field for control, and then the reward and the satisfaction comes when you can actually produce your own fruit. So New Jersey is one of the number 3 peach producing state in the nation, and New Jersey has done a lot of great work breeding peaches, actually right in Cream Ridge, New Jersey. Dr. Joe Gafreda has bred many peach cultivars that are grown throughout the world now, and there's listings throughout Cooperative Extension fact sheets for yellow-fleshed, white-fleshed, flat peach varieties, nectarine varieties, and cultural practices. So all these resources are both in this slideshow and included with the handout for this presentation.
Bill, I just wanted to mention that we're hoping to get Dr. Tom Morton and Joe Gafredo on in a not-too-distant future to talk about their breeding work, because it's pretty fascinating, just talking about many of the varieties that have been developed through the New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station. Many varieties, asparagus to peaches to you name it, even the new basil varieties have been developed right at Rutgers, and they're now being dispersed all throughout the world, and probably some of the best varieties that we've seen out there. So we'll get a chance to talk about that in future episodes.
That's great. I'll definitely be looking forward to hearing both of them speak on that topic.
One quick thing, Bill.
Yeah.
Someone was asking where this house is. Where are you located, generally?
Coastal Monmouth County.
Okay.
We can't give exact locations.
So, next, fruit tree, common one. Starting off with some of the common ones, and unfortunately, many of these common fruits, while they are very delicious, they have some pest and disease problems. And we're going to look at some coming up that are a little more uncommon, that don't have as many pest issues. So it just depends on what your goals are. But plums, everybody is familiar with, and in New Jersey we can grow European plums, Asian plums and American Asian hybrid plums. And so the European plums will pollinate one another, and the Asian plums will pollinate one another. So they're sort of separate, distinct genetic groupings of plums. But they're excellent trees for their flowers alone. Not only are their flowers early and showy, but they're also fragrant. And so this is a great one just as a flowering tree. And so to be able to grow that and have that in the landscape is a benefit. And then as you develop more familiarity and interest and engagement with your landscape, to be able to produce fruit from them is sort of an added bonus to their ornamental quality. So these are great trees as well. And again, plum varieties for New Jersey, there's numerous options depending on what you're looking for, what your goals are, disease resistance, early, mid-season, late season. So there's so many options that are available. Okay, so now we'll take a turn for the unusual.
Bill, we have a few questions on organic control for some of these problems that we have on fruit. One person was asking, is dormant oil spray considered organic? And a few questions on how would we control some of these pest problems organically if possible.
And if you want to weigh in on any of that also, Bill, you're welcome to. There are dormant oils that are organic. If you're looking for organic certification, then you always want to look for the OMRI label, O-M-R-I, that's stamped on a product, and that means that specific material has gone through the approval process. And so there can be different carriers or ingredients within that that have either gone through that approval or not. Copper-based fungicides are common in organic control. Spinosad is another active ingredient that's in many different products for organic insect control. Neem oil is another effective organic control. Kale and clay creates a physical barrier on the fruit. It's actually a very fine powdered clay, and that's another option for plants that are producing fruit to create this physical barrier that the insects can't penetrate. So, Bill, if you want to weigh in on any other options that are available, and there's also other resources throughout Cooperative Extension that can go deep into these topics and provide way more information, but if you want to add anything else.
Bill, you had some very good suggestions there. Any products that are typically OMRI approved, which stands for Organic Materials Research Institute, so you would look for that OMRI label on products, and that could include the oils that you suggested, and you would want to read the label of each one of the products to see whether or not it's labeled for that particular species of plant and the control that you're trying to utilize it for. There are also some different soap materials out there that can be utilized against soft-bodied insects that can be OMRI approved as well. Copper materials, as you had mentioned, are approved for various fungal disease problems. Anytime with fruit trees, right at very early stages of development, you need to start your spray management system and use an integrated pest management control system. And we have fact sheets online at Extension that talk about the different stages of bud development for fruit trees and when to start using some of those copper materials. So we will provide a link online for many of those materials and when you can use them. And Dave is going to bring that up at the very end where you can go for Bill's handout and many of the topics we're discussing today. Thanks, Bill.
Yeah, thank you for that input. And as you go along too, if you have questions when you're actually growing plants and in the field, we're here for you for that support, not only as you're getting started, but if you encounter anything, that's what we do at Cooperative Extension is to help support you in growing your garden and producing these plants. So we're always here to answer your questions and to provide those resources for you anytime. So getting back into one really interesting tree. This is the pawpaw, which people may not be familiar with, but it's actually a tree that's native to North America. And it produces the largest native North American fruit. And not that the tree is the largest fruit tree, it doesn't even necessarily get too big, maxes out at 20 feet or so, but the fruit itself is a very large tropical tasting fruit. It has interesting flowers that I'll show you a picture of that occur in April and May. It's flowering now. And then the fruit ripens later in the season, so September, October or so, and it actually has to be ripe and soft on the tree before it can be harvested. So 2 varieties are required for pollination in this case, and it's actually pollinated by flies instead of by bees or butterflies or birds, for example. But very pest and disease resistant, just not very many issues that affect this tree. Has a really large glossy leaves, and a unique shape that fits well into landscape specimens. And we can see the fall color, the golden leaves on the right side of this tree. So for its ornamental aspects, it ranks very high, and the fruit itself is excellent. So there are grafted cultivars, and they generally have higher quality fruit. You can see on the bottom left, that's the picture of the flower that I was talking about. So it's dark red burgundy flower, and then the young developing fruits, and then the mature fruit. And this is what it looks like inside. It has several large seeds in it, and you don't eat the seeds, and you don't eat the skin, but it's this very soft-fleshed, creamy fruit. So it's a relative of the papaya, and creamy, custardy in texture, kind of has banana papaya flavor, but it doesn't have a very long shelf life. So it will ripen, will be soft, and you'll have a matter of a few days to enjoy it. So these are pawpaws, and they have a great option for edible landscapes. Very disease resistant and excellent quality fruit. This is another native fruit tree. This is the American persimmon, and these will actually get quite a bit larger. So these can grow from 20 to 50 feet, so they can be maintained a little bit smaller with pruning, but minimal pest and disease issues again. In this case, we need a male and a female tree for pollination. So male trees will have male flowers, and female trees will have female flowers, and only the female trees will produce fruit, but it requires the male trees in order to get the pollen to produce the fruit. The flowers are small and not the major attraction to this tree, but it has a nice shape, nice leaves. The fruit is excellent and sweet when harvested late in the season. And you can take a look at the fall foliage as well. So to really get some great fall color from this native tree, that's one of its major attributes. So again, minimal pest and disease issues, good fruit, and good fall color. It's the American persimmon. It's another tree. It's actually in the dogwood family, and it's called the Cornelian cherry, so Cornus moss. And this will grow to sort of small tree size, 15 to 25 feet. You can space them at 10 feet or even closer if you want to create a hedge. And you can see these early yellow flowers. So great yellow color early in the season. We're going to want 2 for pollination. And again, low maintenance. So no major pest or disease issues. So we can reliably have fruit that's produced. And these are actually pretty good fruit. So Cornelian cherry, I think this one has a lot of potential as well. Many people may be familiar with figs, and so this is a great plant, minimal pest and disease issues, and they can be grown very small in containers, and they're cold sensitive, so a lot of people will actually grow them as a container plant and then bring them indoors for the winter, or protect them and then bring them back outside, and they can be grown on a patio or a deck or walkway. So these don't even necessarily have to be planted in the ground. In New Jersey, we're sort of right on the edge of where they'll survive. So all of our figs that are in the ground survived this past winter above ground, mild winter. many people will wrap them in the winter to sort of cover them up, either with burlap or straw, and to cover them up so that they're not damaged by the winter frosts. But choosing hardy cultivars is important. Two very cold hardy cultivars are Chicago Hardy and Brown Turkey. And a lot of local nurseries carry these plants. And, you know, we have our fig, one of our figs is right on the edge of the driveway. So in the fall, we'll drive home and get out of the car and see how many ripe figs there are to eat when we go inside. And so it's a great way to be welcomed home, ripe figs.
Bill, we have a few questions on figs. What would you recommend? People have been bringing them in and they're asking about, okay, what time of the year, what temperature should I be bringing them in? What kind of moisture should I provide for those plants when I do bring them inside, and where should I store them? If you could just elucidate on that a little bit.
Yeah, those are all good questions. And depending on the variety, most figs are hardy down to 10 to 15 degrees. So they can take a frost that's not going to damage them. I usually let the leaves fall off before, wrapping them or doing anything. I generally, all of our figs stay outside just to only want to really grow the toughest ones. But reducing water, so not giving them too much water throughout the winter, so going into a dormant state. You don't want them to rot and be too wet. Keeping them somewhat cool. So if there's a cool basement or something like that, it's a good area for them to be in. Semi-heated garage, attached garage, places like that, those are good areas for them, where they're still going to be able to go dormant for the season, but they're not going to get below that 15 degrees or so. And sometimes, if they're outside or if they get too cold, the top will die back, but the roots will still survive, and you'll have new growth from the roots. So if that happens, the figs will produce. They can actually produce 2 crops per season. So if the above ground stems survive, they can produce an early crop on last year's growth, and then later a fall crop on this season's growth. So the advantage too, if you can get them to survive, not only will they be larger plants, but you can actually manage 2 crops in a season. So that's hopefully what we might see this year.
Excellent. Thank you, Bill.
We had another question. Go ahead. I was just going to...
Question?
There's another question on the pollination here. How close do 2 trees need to be to have good cross-pollination?
That's a good question, and it depends for each individual species that we're talking about. Usually, if you're within, 20 feet definitely is close enough. 50 feet to 100 feet might be getting a little bit far, but it depends on the species. Plums, especially the Asian hybrid plums, they actually like to grow as close together as possible, even to the point where their branches can intertwine to get optimum pollination. But following sort of this general spacing requirements should be okay. And again, it's specific for every species, so yeah, I'd recommend just looking that up before getting into it. Okay, so next plant, we're going to talk about 2 different nut species that can be planted in your edible landscape. One being the American chestnut. So this is a great specimen tree. It's an excellent shade tree. It's native. It used to grow all over the East Coast, and then we all know the chestnut blight that sort of took them down and removed them from our ecosystem. But thanks to breeding work over the years, there are blight-resistant varieties that are now available. They've been bred to be either tolerant or resistant to chestnut blight, and so we want to look for those. I put the link up top for ACF, which is the American Chestnut Foundation. It's a great organization to learn more about this tree. It will get large, 50 to 75 feet tall, and it can spread as well. But great for shade. Has really interesting flowers. So in the bottom right, you're seeing flowers, and in the top right, I've got a little flower buds developing and a young chestnut fruit developing as well. It's just, interesting, unique, native trees that are, we can reintroduce into this landscape. And Bill mentioned Dr. Tom Molnar, or he mentioned our hazelnut program at Rutgers, and so this is hazelnuts are another great edible landscape crop that we can use. So they're going to produce nuts that are high in carbohydrates and protein and oils, and they also have a disease that will affect them on the East Coast called the Eastern filbert blight. And Dr. Tom Molnar from Rutgers University has been working on developing resistant hazelnut varieties, and he's just now, releasing them for public growth and to be grown on farms. We have demonstration plots at Cream Ridge Field Station in Monmouth County, and so we're really excited to see these hazelnuts get out into people's yards and fields and into the world, really. So this is great work that he's been doing. And they can form a hedge in your yard, so planted close together, they can form a multi-stemmed hedge, or they can be grown as small trees trained to a single stem. So this is a great plant for edges of the yard, good edible landscape plant. All right, any other questions before we move on to our next category, being the shrubs?
So there was a question on trees that might be more adaptable to wet conditions that people may have in their yards.
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's not a lot of edible species that thrive in the wet conditions. It might be more conducive to growing something else, but a lot of the times, these trees are going to want dry root systems in order to be healthy. I don't know if you have any recommendations really for edible trees that would grow in wet areas.
Not really. Wet areas are difficult for a lot of the fruiting trees that I have seen, because it's just, once you start taking oxygen away from the root systems, it's hard to really get fruiting to develop properly. So you're really limited in terms of what you can grow in those conditions.
Yeah.
Also, Bill, somebody asked about pruning nectarines. I know you were talking about that a little bit, and removal of water sprouts on those. Could you touch base on that just a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. Pruning. So pruning is, for all species. I really like pruning. I get excited for it. It's one of the first activities you can do in the very early spring and late winter, and it's a great way to sort of get out and start to interact with your garden after being inside for the winter. And so some different species have different requirements for pruning, but two of the basic tenets that I like to think about when pruning is to remove any dead wood and any branches that are growing in a bad direction. So what does that mean? What's a bad direction for the plants to be growing in? And so when we think about that, we want to increase airflow to the plant, increase sunlight. So anywhere where we have branches crossing up with one another, where they're rubbing on one another, or trying to grow in the same space, or one's growing back into the center of the tree where there's going to be shade and reduced airflow and more potential for disease, those would be some of the branches we would look to remove. There's either central leader training or open vase training, and many different pruning methods, and so we want to look to the individual species for how to address that. Once we start talking about raspberries and blackberries, they have their own pruning requirements as well. So those are, it's just learning about the individual species, but as a short answer, dead wood, branches that are growing in a bad direction. So we also have a note here from Lauren Erickson, who is doing research and question answering control as well, and she has said that hickory and persimmons are potentially plants that can be grown in wet areas. So it's a nut tree and our native persimmon that might be potential for that wet area. So thank you, Lauren, for chiming in with that. Okay, any other questions? Very good. Good questions, everyone. Thank you for everything. So our next topic are shrubs. And so there's many fruit-producing shrubs that also produce excellent flowers, and these really can fit in well to edible landscapes. So you might not have room for a 20-foot tall tree or even a 12-foot tall tree, but you might have room for shrubs. And there are several that can actually produce some pretty good fruit in your yard. Again, most of these are going to want full sun and well-drained soils for maximum productivity, fruit sugars, and reduced disease pressure. So we'll take a look at some of these, starting with some that are probably going to be very familiar to you, and then I've got some other interesting options. So let's look at blueberries first. So something that many people who live in New Jersey and garden in New Jersey probably are familiar with. But if you've only grown them or only purchased them in the grocery store or at the farm stand and you've seen the fruit, you might not have a sense of the aesthetic components of this plant. So on the top we can see the white bell-shaped flowers of blueberries, and you know, these are a nice flower to have incorporated into the landscape. They almost look like you can see the young developing blueberry fruit in the shape of the flower. They have a similarity, and so these are nice flowers to have. And of course, who doesn't like to see clusters of ripe blueberries on the vine? This is a great addition to the landscape. And then on the bottom, the blueberries can also offer some great fall foliage. So the red color, pretty dramatic in this picture, and we can have that says something interesting in the fall as well. So 3 different seasons of visual interest for the blueberry, in addition to having very good, high quality and nutritious fruit. So this is a native plant as well, and depending on the variety, they can grow anywhere from 3 to 6 feet tall and require similar spacing, depending on that size. One thing that's very important, though, to consider when planting blueberries is they have very specific pH requirements in the soil. So they thrive in acidic conditions, a low pH, 4.0 to 4.5. And this can be determined from a soil test, but this is different than the pH that most of your other fruit trees and shrubs will grow in. So most of the other plants are going to thrive in 6.5 range, 6.5 to 7.0, and blueberry is quite a bit more acidic. So they might have to grow in their own section of the garden that's more acidic, or you amend the soil. So sulfur is a way that we can bring soil pH down, soil amendment that can be added if we need to lower the pH and optimize it for blueberries. But all of those recommendations will be included in your soil test when you send that to the Rutgers Soil Testing Lab. Blueberries also have very shallow roots, and they can be impacted by weed competition or drought, especially when they're just getting established. So shallow roots closer to the soil surface, they're going to be more affected in this way. So mulch can really help them. If you see native blueberries growing in the woods, they've evolved with thick organic matter covering them. So this can really help to get them thriving, keep the moisture in, reduce the weed competition. You will get fruit with just one variety, but you get better pollination and better production if you have 2 or more. And by the 3rd year, you should be starting to have fruit. So there's been a lot of great work done at Rutgers with blueberries as well. We've got some fact sheets establishing blueberries at home and selecting specific cultivars for the home garden. So there's early season, mid-season, and late season, so you can harvest. Any other questions, or Bill, you want to add anything on blueberries?
Yeah, just a couple things, Bill. Excellent information. I just wanted to add that with blueberries, we have been growing them successfully in other parts of the state. Some people think that they necessarily have to have sandy soils. That's not necessarily true. If we add a little bit more organic matter and put them on raised beds and provide adequate moisture through drip irrigation and mulch around those blueberries, we can actually grow a pretty good crop. And with blueberries, there are many different varieties that come in throughout the season, so you want to make sure you plant a variety of different genetics so that you have blueberries coming in over a longer period of time. Relatively low maintenance crop. In some areas, the birds do get to them, so you may need to use some additional netting to protect them. But really a great crop, providing, if you provide adequate nutrition and the right pH and provide some good old-fashioned compost and peat moss in the soil, you'll get a good production of blueberries.
Great, thank you. And if you have blueberries growing in your yard and you need some help or not sure what's going on with them and you want to take up the productivity a notch, just give us a call, give your local extension office a call, and we're happy to help you with that. This is another native plant that there's been some research around at Rutgers recently. Pete Nietzsche has done some work with beach plum, and so this is an excellent plant. I was actually at the beach earlier this week, and I saw that beach plum is flowering, so growing in a sand dune. We have this plant, so native to New Jersey, grows 4 feet tall on small cultivars and up to 15 feet tall, can be maintained with pruning and spacing 6 to 10 feet apart. So a lot of these shrubs, if you plant them closer, you can create a hedge with them, or you can plant them farther apart and let them grow and spread. So this is a great plant, and you may have seen this, actually growing in the sand. See the profuse white flowers that occur this time of the year. The fruit itself is high in antioxidants. Some varieties are better than others for fresh eating, but it is, commonly made into jam. So you may have had beach plum jam before or heard of that. It's a very common thing. And beach plum wine is another thing that people are starting to do with these as well. So low maintenance plant, sort of a new thing to think about in terms of an edible or an edible landscape plant, but it's native. It's been in New Jersey for a long time. And so there's some information, the link on the bottom and included in the handout, some of the work that's been done to optimize the productivity and field conditions for beach plum. This is another native North American plant, low maintenance, minimal pest and disease pressure. This is Juneberry, serviceberry. It's also very similar. So there's different species in this genus. They have slightly different growth habits, but for the most part, very similar plants. And depending on the species or the individual cultivar of that species, they're actually named and bred cultivars now. They can grow anywhere in the 6 to 10 foot range. These are self-pollinating. You can see the white flowers. They occur very early in the season, and the fruit also occurs very early. So these are one of the first fruits to be ready. So they're similar to blueberries, but they don't have sort of as rich of a flavor. They're sort of a mild tasting blueberry. They're sweet, but they don't sort of have the complex acidity of a blueberry is how I would explain the flavor of Juneberries. But great plant. You can see also excellent fall foliage, native plant, low maintenance, minimal pest and disease pressure.
Excellent plant, Bill. I have these in my front yard. The birds usually try to get them before I do. Very sweet. Last year was a particularly good year for production of Amelanchier canadensis. We had an excellent yield of these guys, and we actually harvested some, and we were eating them for quite a long time. But some years you can get a really significant yield off of these plants, and the flavor is really good. You can make jams and jellies out of them. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And that makes me think too, we talk about, protecting our plants from birds and wildlife, and I think that's really important, especially when we have small yards and we're putting a lot of time and effort into taking care of these plants. But if you have a larger landscape and several acres, having wildlife plantings, edible fruit species for wildlife is not necessarily a bad idea. And maybe you're not growing them for you to harvest, but you're growing them for the birds and for the wildlife, and to encourage that biodiversity, back into the landscape is just another opportunity and something that we can do with these plants, if that is your goal. This is a plant, elderberry, Sambucus nigra. It's a native plant also. I really like this plant. There are different cultivars also that will range in sizes, but you can see this can fill in, can form a hedge very nicely. The traditional sort of green leaves with white flowers is an option, but then there's also ornamental cultivars such as black lace, for example, and black beauty, and they have this dark purple foliage and these pink flowers. And so those are really nice, really ornamental component as well. So the berries, you may have seen sort of health products and natural products, juices and immune syrups and things like that are made from elderberries. So they're sort of gaining popularity in that market. The seeds from elderberries are toxic, so the seeds are not made into the products. They're generally either boiled off and have a syrup created, for example. They have a degree of resistance, so this is a good one as well. And they're low maintenance, so minimal pest and disease pressure. And there are a handful of farms in New Jersey, few, that are growing them. There's more interest, there are more people planting them, and there are nurseries that carry these plants. So this is a great one. It grows very fast. It's easy to propagate. So when you plant propagation skills from hardwood cuttings, this one is very easy to propagate to make more plants as well. Any questions or comments? All right, very good. This is another native plant. It's great for pollinators. Common name is chokeberry, but there are several plants that seem to have adopted that common name. But Aronia melanocarpa is the scientific name, and you might see this referred to as Aronia or Aronia berry. And there's also starting to see more and more health supplements and sort of natural products that contain Aronia berries. So this one's sort of up and coming as well. And it is high in antioxidants. Smaller than some of the others, especially some of the dwarf cultivars can be as small as 3 feet. This one's very low input, resists drought, insects, pollution, disease, has good pollinator flowers, deer resistance. This is a tough native plant. Unfortunately, the berries are very astringent, and they're not the best for fresh eating, but you can make jams or syrups with them. They do have an edible potential, but this is not the berry that you would want to grab a handful of and eat them on your way from the driveway. But this can be a great edge plant or natural restoration plant, or if we are growing food for wildlife and pollinators, this is a nice one as well.
Bill?
Yes.
There's a question on the toxicity of some of these things to their pets, dogs, cats. And in particular, somebody had a question on the elderberry. But I'm sure that some of these, you probably don't want them to eat too many. It would require probably a significant quantity of them to make them sick. But I don't know what you suggest or.
Yeah, I don't know enough to say definitively one way or the other on that. It's a low amount of toxicity, and they're very small seeds. I don't know how many an animal would have to consume to actually make them sick. So if you're, that's something you would want to look into, I would think, if you are concerned that your animal might eat a lot of the berries. But Yeah, it's a good question.
Okay.
Bill, there's a question from a few people on which ones of these plants do you think might do better in containers? Because many people don't have a lot of space to grow many of these plants. So which have you had success with growing in containers?
Sure, yeah. Figs are great for containers. I think there are some dwarf and mini apple trees that can be grown in containers. Any of the common fruit trees, there are very small dwarfing specimens that can be grown in containers. Anytime you're growing anything in a container, though, you have to really pay attention to watering and fertility because it's restricted in that regard. Another plant actually that we grow, and I didn't include it in this presentation, I thought about it, are citrus trees. And so lemons, oranges, limes, for example, those can be grown in containers. They have to be brought indoors for the winter, but they survive and thrive as a house plant through the winter, and then we transition them outside for the summer. So they have excellent fragrant flowers, and can actually produce a small citrus crop. So those are nice potted edible as well. Okay. Next plant that we're looking at, these are bush cherries, and there's a few different species in this Prunus genus that they're actually pretty good and similar in this regard. And so this that we're looking at right here, this is actually a Korean bush cherry. And so this produces nice white blooms early in the season. So this is one of the first things to bloom. So it's covered in white flowers, and these set fruit and turn into these little pie cherries, is how I like to think of them. So they're a little bit tart. They are actually decent for fresh eating. I eat them fresh. They have a pit in them, but they're quite good. Excellent for pies and for jams. Easier to grow than sweet cherries, for example, and they occupy a much smaller space. These are self-pollinating. The most difficult thing about this plant is just picking all the berries off of it, and that's not that hard to do. So it's a tough plant, stress tolerant, low maintenance, minimal pest and disease issues, if any. Maybe the birds will get some of them, but they don't even take too many. So this is Korean bush cherry. Nanking cherry is another similar one, and then there's hybrids of those plants as well. And so this is a great way that you can have pie cherries without having a large cherry tree in your yard. Okay, coming back into some familiar fruits, blackberries. These are an excellent option. Any of the brambles, especially for the edges of yards, you can create a hedge with them. There are different growth habits of blackberries, so it's important to recognize that before selecting them. So upright blackberries, those are going to grow just like you would think. So they're going to grow upright. They're not really going to need support or very minimal support. And then there are semi-upright or trailing varieties as well, which would be the ones that would need the most support. And the trailing varieties, so I put 10-foot spacing on there, and that's because they can grow in 5 feet from either direction from where they're planted. So you can see they sort of send the canes out from the base. They don't spread underground the same way raspberries do. They sort of stay in this centralized crown area, and they send up multiple canes from there. And so this can grow and it can spread just along a simple wire support system or along the fence. They can be trained, and they can go very far in either direction. So you only need, a few plants in very little amount of soil, and they can grow and spread throughout the area. So early, mid, and late season berries, you can have blackberries coming in from July through September. and we're going to see those fruit on the second year growth. So anything that fruits 1 year will not fruit the next year. So it's they sort of grow for a season, and then that cane will fruit the next season. And so you have to adapt your pruning strategies to remove the canes that have already fruited. And that's similar for raspberries as well. There are also thornless varieties of blackberries, which can be ideal for edible landscapes, especially if you have children, or especially if you don't like getting poked by blackberry thorns, which would be me included. And so thornless blackberries are a great option for when you're pruning them, harvesting them. They're just a lot easier to handle. Blackberries are also very easy to propagate. So when you are pruning them, we've pruned back blackberries and just stuck the cuttings into a pot of potting soil, and they developed roots. So this is an easy one to propagate and a great way to start to learn about plant propagation. Another common edible landscape plant are raspberries. So great plant. These will spread underground a little more so. And so these plants will sort of form their own hedge. So just think about that, and to contain them in the area that you want them to be in. So you can see in this picture, these raspberries are more or less contained in a lawn system. There's the raised bed that they exist in, and probably an underground rhizome barrier beneath the bed. And that should more or less keep them under control. So if you don't want them to spread too far, there are rhizome barriers that you can sort of bury into the ground to keep them maintained in an area. So that can be a good thing, but if you want to fill in a section with the raspberry patch, but just something to be aware of. And there are, we're most familiar with red raspberries, but there's also yellow and purple varieties that have their own unique flavors. So these can be very good, and you might not be able to find them at a store, for example, but local farms may have them, or you can start to grow some really unique things at home that might not be available in other places. We often overlook vine crops in our landscaping systems, and vines are great because they can grow in vertical space. So you can see in the picture on the right, this is mostly a tiled floor system, and on this patio, and we have a small space where this tremendous trunk of a grape is growing out and providing shade over this area. So this is, really a nice blending of the built environment and natural environment together. So it's like a living sitting room that has been created in conjunction with this plant. So just a really creative way to use this. And on the left, we see super simple space that grapes can grow as well. This is chain link fence, totally sufficient support structure, and a way to produce a tremendous amount of food. So vertical space requiring very little space in the ground, vines can grow up over it and really have some creative landscaping elements. So again, we can see other illustrations of patios and arbors, trellis to grow along the fence, just like our espalier fruit trees. So they grow in this flat space where we can, even if we have a small space, these can have a great application. Grapes really like it well drained though, so they're not going to do well in wet sites, and they have some cold sensitivity as well. So you want to make sure that for the best results, you're selecting disease-resistant varieties that are specifically developed for this climate, for New Jersey. And there's been a lot of work, at Rutgers going into helping support the grape industry and growing grapes at home. So there's plenty of resources available. Any questions?
Yeah, Bill, just to let people know, we do have a seminar coming up on Are You Ready to Garden, where one of our colleagues is going to be talking about grapes, actually making wine and also edible grapes as well. So we're actually going to have a whole session on that for people that are interested in it, so we can get into much more detail down the road.
There's a couple of questions on Espalier. Are there any good books on that you know of?
That's a good question. That book I mentioned earlier, the Landscaping with Fruit book by Lee Reich, that has some information on it. It's not specifically about that entirely, but he does include some examples and how to do that actually.
I think a lot of the pruning books that are out there too, they usually include a section on Espalier plants and how to do it. Also, that pergola, like how long would it take? They're asking about how long it would take for that to grow across that whole area there, or even part of it.
That's a good question.
Many years, or?
Yeah, that's going to take several years, and it depends on the site and the soil conditions, and how fast your plant's going to grow. I'm going to say 5 to 6 years minimum to get that sort of coverage.
Okay.
Right, and that's great that there's going to be, the in-depth grape lecture, and any of these crops really could be a little more, can be a whole lecture on its own. So this is sort of to inspire some ideas and think about what's possible, and then learning more about each individual one is up to whatever plants interest you the most. This is another great plant for vine vertical growth. This is the hardy kiwi, and so there's actually 2 species, Actinidia arguta and Actinidia colomitica. So they're different species. The arguta is a little bit more aggressive and vigorous growing than the colomitica, and in both cases they require separate male and female plants. So one male can provide pollen for 6 females, but it's essential to have at least one male in order to get fruit. So minimal pest issues, minimal disease issues. It'll take a little while before they produce fruit, but they're incredibly productive once they start going. The picture on the right is a male colomitica variety, and they actually have variegated leaves. So even in addition to the fruit-producing aspect, they have an ornamental foliage. And the fruit, if you haven't had them before, they're about the size of grapes. They have no fuzz on the outside, and they taste just like a kiwi that you would have in the grocery store. So you can eat the whole thing. The fruit is smooth, and they're excellent, super productive plants. So I'll show you, they can grow in very vertical spaces as well. So if we look at this picture on this video, we can see this is not necessarily a spot where you would think a garden would thrive. We've got maybe 4 feet or so between a fence and the side of a shed, and we have hardy kiwis growing along the shed that are trellised on the shed. We've got 1 male in the middle and 2 females on the 2 sides of it, and we've turned sort of a non-productive garden space into an area where we can have fruit-producing plants. And so you can see vigorous growth. They're thriving right now. They're getting just about ready to flower. They have some buds that are about to open, but small space in the actual ground where they're growing, so they're not occupying a large amount of soil. They're not spreading aside from laterally and vertically up the side of the trellis, and we're maximizing this area where other things might be able to grow. And they're able to grow tall enough that they can reach the sun. So it's a great way to utilize sort of marginal space sometimes. One more vine crop that I'll just mention. This is Schizandra. So this one might not be familiar to people, but berries are used in traditional medicine. It's actually native to the forests of China. So it would grow up the trees in Chinese forests. And the berries have very high value, and they're starting to appear in many natural supplements and health products. So minimal pest and disease issues. It's a tough plant. Nice foliage on the spine. Very colorful red berries. and their berries possess all 5 basic flavors. So it's a very interesting fruit. They're salty, sweet, sour, spicy, and bitter all at the same time. So if you can find Schisandra berry, definitely recommend trying them, or grow your own and you can try them. Okay, briefly, we'll take a look at some of these herb layers. So some of these plants that are lower growing, in the 1 to 2 foot range. Many of them are familiar edibles, but I want to take a minute to appreciate the landscape quality of them as well, and sort of the aesthetic components. So this is rosemary, that many people will be familiar with, and sort of right on the edge as to whether it will survive or not in New Jersey. And so this is on the southwest side of the property under the base of a peach tree, and so it gets good sun exposure, afternoon sun, and these are some plants that have been overwintering for a few years for us now. A few years ago, we just planted multiple roseberry plants throughout the yard in different locations where we thought they might be, warm locations, warm, sunny microclimates, and many different rosemary plants. And the ones that survived, those are the ones that we kept. Those were the toughest plants growing in the best location. So it was a little bit of an experiment, and as a result, we've got some really nice plants that survive year to year, and they're actually flowering. So they're producing these delicate, sort of purplish, light flowers. So they're great plants as well. Really like well-drained, Mediterranean type climates. These can also be grown in a pot. These are a good one for any of these culinary herbs and medicinal herbs. These are great for growing in pots as well. This is parsley. We actually do grow this in a wooden box. So probably are familiar with it as a garnish. It's a biennial, meaning that it will flower in its second year, and it tends to reseed itself and keep coming back. And so we have parsley that keeps coming up and growing in the same box. And personally, I don't even necessarily care for eating parsley that much, but it produces flowers that are great for pollinators. And you can see in the bottom picture, we get the caterpillars of monarch and swallowtail butterflies. They love this plant, and they eat it. They will strip the leaves off of this plant, lay their eggs, and develop into butterflies. So this is that's why we grow this plant. And if you like parsley, you're welcome to eat it, but I'll leave this on for the butterflies. Garden sage, this is a plant, woody perennial, Mediterranean native, so warm and dry areas and full sun on the garden. And it's got a unique sort of silvery green and fuzzy leaf texture to add that component to the ornamental aspect of the garden. Great purple flowers for pollinators, and it can be used for many culinary uses and as a digestive aid. So you may have this plant in your spice cabinet, but this is its application in the garden as well. Echinacea, purple coneflower, which also comes in many different colors now. This is a great pollinator plant, native, low input. I'm sure you will be talking about this in the upcoming sessions on native plants. And I bring this up as a plant for creating herbal teas. So thinking about our edibles, not just in our fruit and nut producing, but in developing our own teas as well. This is a great one that can be used. So all of the parts of the plants can be used: the leaf, the flower, the seed, and the roots. Bee balm is another native plant. It's very common that you will see this in our garden centers in New Jersey. Pollinators love it, hence the name, bee balm. Very low input. We create herbal teas with it, has a spicy flavor, and can develop tremendous color in the garden. So low input, easy, tough plant. Anisissa, great pollinator plant. This one was mentioned during last week's session as well. And we sort of allow this plant to naturalize in our garden, being that it reseeds and it starts to come up in where it wants to. And so we don't have to plant it from year to year. It doesn't get so aggressive that it becomes very weedy. If it's growing somewhere we don't want it, we just pull it out. But we allow it to spread, and then we can harvest it from different areas in the garden. And it has this great mild licoricey flavor, and the bees love this. So great purple spike-shaped flowers. Been getting a lot of calls lately from growers who are wanting to start producing lavender on their farm. And this is, I think, a great idea. It's a great pollinator plant, very fragrant and showy, low input, and it's deer resistant. So I think that is, definitely part of the attraction to wanting to grow this. So this is a great one that we can see more of. It can be grown in pots, can be grown in the field. It does not want to be wet, so warm, well-drained Mediterranean-style climates. And, of course, we can make lavender cookies or lavender lemonade with it as well. So that's how it got into the edible landscaping talk here. This is another great plant. So this is one that maybe some of you have never seen before. This is sea kale. So this is native to the shores of Europe and low input, so it grows in sand and rocky shorelines, attracts pollinators when it flowers, and the shoots, the leaves, and the little broccoli florets are all edible. So you can eat most parts of this plant. It can be divided. It's easy to grow. It's good for coastal areas, and just very unique, interesting plant. So this goes into the perennial vegetable category. It's actually not related to kale, our annual kale that we grow. It's just another option, another perennial option, as is the Egyptian walking onion. This is a perennial onion crop. All parts are edible. The leaves, stems, shoots, the roots, tubers, all parts are edible. Deer resistant, easy to propagate and spread. So these onion bulbils that form on the top of the plant will actually fall over and walk across the garden. Low input, and one of the first things that's available to eat in the spring. So this is one of the first things coming up in the garden before any of the annual vegetables are going. You can be harvesting Egyptian onions. The last thing I want to mention is just a few ground cover plants, and these grow along the ground, and they can sort of conserve moisture for the system, outcompete weeds once they're established. And the first one's an annual plant. This is nasturtium. This can be grown in containers, or it can be planted in your landscape. It will have to be planted each year. It's an annual, but as a trailing growth habit, and the flowers, which are very showy, are also edible. So these often go into salad mixes. They sort of have a spicy, peppery flavor, but this one is frost sensitive, so this is sort of a only for the summer enjoyment kind of plant. I know Bill Lubick has extensive experience on strawberries, and I include these as a ground cover. Once you have your weeds under control, so strawberries can cover the ground if you have weeds under control. I'll mention there are two different general categories: June-bearing strawberries that are going to produce one large crop late spring, and there are day-neutral berries that will produce smaller harvests both in the spring and the fall. So depending on what your goals are, you can use either of these types of strawberries. And generally, our June-bearing strawberries are going to see, in the second year is when we're going to get the real harvest from them. They like rich soil, organic matter, and mulch, and they're going to spread by runners. So you can propagate them and move them to other parts of your garden by dividing their runners. And some small space options, we can see strawberry hanging baskets. So if your space is small, you can only have a hanging basket. It's one option. And we have strawberries growing on the side of a pallet. There are all sorts of creative ways to incorporate strawberries into your landscape in small spaces. Bill, anything you want to add on strawberries?
We're going to cover it on another session, but I just wanted to mention that the Rutgers Scarlet is out there, and for anybody that wants to order that, it is available through several different sources out there carrying the Rutgers Scarlet. Also, Camarosa, another great variety, and Flavor Fest, that's a new one out of USDA. These are all June-bearer strawberries that have excellent yields, great flavor, are adapted to our area. One that many growers grow locally is called Chandler, which is a little bit easier to grow than many other berries. It doesn't require a lot of input and tends to produce a pretty good yield. if you're going to grow the everbearing strawberries, Albion and EV2 are two excellent varieties that have given us excellent yield. My favorite strawberries are always the June bearers because they just tend to me, they have the best size and the best flavor overall. But typically we'll get anywhere from 1 to 2 pounds of berries per plant, and that can vary depending on nutrition and the situation in the soil. But strawberries can be a very good crop to grow and relatively easy. You get especially with June bearers, you get an early season crop. This year we've had some damage because of the frost. So we saw some damage to early flowers. So if you have different varieties that flower early, mid, and later season, then you'll have a better chance of getting a good yield on June bearers. And then varieties, the everbearers like Albion and EV2 and others like San Andreas will flower sometimes and produce berries a second and sometimes a third time, depending on how long the season is.
Great, thank you. One more ground cover, and this is another common kitchen herb. We see this is the thyme, in particular creeping thyme, and you can see the way that this can spread along pathways, along rocks, along rock walls, and when it flowers, it has these pink, purple, very small flowers. Pollinators love them, and so this is a great one to just spread and to cover the ground throughout your garden. You can walk on this too, so it's great culinary plant. You can also make a spicy tea from thyme if you haven't tried that before. So it's a nice one to include in the edible landscape. To share one more video with you, putting everything together in the edible landscape. So we've got some garlic, and a viburnum in the background, and then some annual vegetables, some kale and some lettuce and a peony, integrating our edible annual plants along with ornamental perennial species. But notice that the taller perennials are in the background, and in the sunny southern side we have the annuals. We've got strawberries and anatisip as ground cover, some young apple trees that just finished flowering and starting to produce fruit, in addition to traditional landscape plants like lilacs. That plant that hasn't developed leaves yet, that's a fig that's just starting to open up. Some more apples that are starting to produce fruit, got a good fruit set. That's a spirea on the left, and the trailing blackberries and some raspberries and a fig on the right. Just a lot of options and things that you can do to incorporate color and food and different shapes of plants, and sort of using the different areas, whether it's a flat area along the fence or a large spreading area. There are plants, edible plants for all of these options. And so it's all about getting outside and working in your garden, interacting with your landscape, and engaging here. And so in the winter, you can be thinking about your garden, planning, calling up your extension office to ask them questions and learn, and reading fact sheets and different resources. In the spring, getting out there as soon as possible to do some pruning and mulching, add compost, maybe plant some new plants this year. And then in the summer, we're watering, weeding, spraying, and hopefully, if all things go right, we're harvesting. But it's all about enjoying the garden. So you want to enjoy the work that you're doing, take the time to spend to enjoy the peaceful aspects of it. And in the fall, we're harvesting, cleaning up, mulching the beds. I just mentioned that many of our New Jersey nurseries have a lot of these edible landscape plants. And if they don't have them, then we can order them for you. They can be a great resource. They're very knowledgeable, so I encourage you to visit your nurseries. And just want to thank you for listening, and to thank Bill Lubick and Middlesex County for hosting us, for Monmouth County and the Monmouth County Freeholders and our Grown in Monmouth Economic Development Program in Monmouth County. And in Rutgers Cooperative Extension, we're here when you need us. We're here to help you achieve your gardening goals and to answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank Bill and for his time and for sharing his expertise. And it's been a great pleasure having him on the program. Every Wednesday, just to let everybody know, if you have gardening questions, you can join us on our helpline live. And you can email our master gardeners at co.middlesex.nj.us if you have questions. We have a team of wonderful master gardeners that are there to help answer questions throughout the week. And the helpline live is on every Wednesday at 10.
If I may, one more time, thank you for joining us. But also, if you want to get that fact sheet that Bill mentioned, please do follow that address, tinyurl.com/Middlesex County Grows, and you'll get to our county extension website, and you can get that information and learn all about our programs and departments. We also have the Earth Day at Home series videos.
Yes, that's a great video.
Check out from our Rutgers environmental stewards. They're on Mondays at 6:30, and there's a little tiny URL you could type into your browser to get access to our environmental stewards for their Monday night show. That's tinyurl.com, Earth Day at Home. Also, our local 4-H department has some presentations coming up as well. If you want to find out about 4-H for your kids and your family, go to the address tinyurl.com 4-H presents, and you can see their schedule.
We're going to be on every Thursday at 6:30, and we'd love to see you again.
And to make sure you get invited, just visit tinyurl.com, Middlesex County Grows, which brings you to our county webpage. And there'll be a button there that you'll click and get that email invite to the program. And you can also email our master gardeners with your address with ConCon as the subject. And we'll make sure you get on our constant contact emailing list for all our programs.
That's going to be it for us, and we look forward to seeing you next time on Are You Ready to Garden?